सना है या अली। इल्म भी तुझसे मिला मौला, इश्क की तू इंतहा मौला। या मौला या मौला, तू नूर है मौला। या मौला या मौला, जलाल है मौला। या मौला औलिया का बादशाह है या अली, बेकसों का आसरा है या अली। तू ही हक का सिलसिला मौला, तू दवा है तू शिफा मौला। या मौला या मौला, मुश्किल कुशा मौला। या मौला या मौला, तेरा करम मौला। या मौला या मौला। मौला
Il va, arriver. Il est arrivé. Mara Maula ke neda padarshe, saath rahmat ane barakat laushe. Mu'minuna dilda harshe ubhrashe. Mu'minuna dilda harshe ubhrashe. Like the first day of the spring, all the beauty that it brings. Upon the coming of the light is a chance for us to shine brighter and brighter and brighter. Fly higher and higher and higher. All of the darkness gone away, wings of love and a brand new day. Struggling for my words today, but my heart jumps in and begins to sing brighter and brighter and brighter. Fly higher and higher and higher. Aya Maulana, Aya Maulana, Aya Maulana, Aya Maulana. तुम्हारे आने से नूर भरा है,
दिलों में जहानों में आज अश्कों भी रोशन है।
C'est toi qu'on désire voir, soleil de nos espoirs. C'est toi que l'on accueillit, la beauté de l'avenir. Ta lumière nous illumine tous.
so we shine brighter and brighter and brighter.
And all throughout time, it's through you we unite.
No mountain, no river, no desert means that we're always together.
Paraje kholiya che rahmat ane swargana dwara liyo alayna bino pyare.
So we shine brighter and brighter and brighter. Fly higher and higher and higher. Aya Maulana, Aya Maulana, Aya Maulana, Aya Maulana, Aya Maulana, Aya Maulana, Aya Maulana.
Le temps est arrivé, le temps est arrivé, le temps est arrivé. Moge mounurani shude.
ایا خدا به عصر درخشان خوش آمدی. وقت شفاعت و صبح نمایان خوش آمدی. آئینگے آئینگے آ گئے مولا. 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 آیا مولانا، آیا مولانا، آیا مولانا،
Il est arrivé.
Yali Madat, welcome, bienvenue, a very warm welcome to tonight's Friday Night Reflections to our Jamat and our multi-faith family members. My name is Farah Nasser, and as always, it is such an honor and privilege to be with you today and to be hosting this program on this special Friday night, which I'll tell you about in just a moment. The last time I spoke with you, my kids were enjoying time in the backyard, time with family, lots of at-home activities and science experiments and a lot of baking. Well, now everybody's back at school. The stunning fall colors are in full bloom. I'm back in the studio at work anchoring the news, which is very busy. And life has really picked up some of its previous pace, though obviously in what is still a difficult environment as we go through the second wave of COVID-19. I hope you and your families are keeping safe. I hope you're managing to weather the challenges of these times as well as you possibly can. Tonight, I'm excited to share with you that we have a very special guest, Dr. Mahmoud Ibu. Dr. Ibu was appointed by Maulana Hazar Imam as the first diplomatic representative of the Ismaili Imamat and AKDN to Canada. That was back in September of 2014. He served for 10 years as chairman of the Leaders International Forum, or LIF, overseeing the Jamat's leadership in over 23 countries. Prior to this, he served as president of the Aga Khan Council for the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. He was co-founder of Quantum Laser. That's a company specializing in the manufacture and repair of gas turbine airfoils for the aviation and power generation industries. Dr. Ibu was born in Kenya. He was educated at Harrow School in England. He obtained a Bachelor of Science in Materials Technology in 1975, and then subsequently in 1979, a PhD in Laser Engineering at Imperial College London. He currently lives in Ottawa with his wife Karima, with whom he has 2 daughters. Dr. Ibu, thank you for joining us. It is such a pleasure to have you with us. Dr. Ibu, thank you so much for joining us. It is such a pleasure to be able to talk to you and ask you questions that I'm sure many of us have. And I'm going to start with this one. What is the role of the AKDN representative to Canada?
Well, first of all, thank you, Farah, and good evening to everybody, and a pleasure to be on Friday Night Reflections. Thank you so much for asking that question. And I thought before I sort of respond to it directly, I might give a little context. And the context is that the notion of representation, the notion of diplomacy, is not new to the Ismaili Imamate. It has been practiced for centuries, where the Imam of the time, in some cases when the Imam was the Caliph, had ambassadors and envoys that were sent to other courts or governments at a particular period in time. So the idea of diplomacy, the idea of the Imam of the time having a representation in other parts is not a new concept, but it does manifest itself differently in contemporary times. And just to give a sense of that, I think it's useful perhaps for us to reflect on where the Imamate was in 1957. I think that the Jamat will recall that in 1957, none of the countries that we deal with today actually existed in their current form. So all of sub-Saharan African countries were not yet even born as countries. They were still colonized at the time by the British and the French and the Germans. Our Jamaat in the countries that today we know of in Central and South Asia did not exist. They were behind the Iron Curtain. And India and Pakistan were only 10 years old as countries. So in the early days of the Imamate, the idea of international engagement, of having agreements with countries was still very much in its infancy. But it was during the 60s when these countries got independence, and then later on in the early 90s with the collapse of the Soviet Union, as the Imamate began to engage in these countries in a structured way through the agencies of the network, initiating first of all with the foundation and then expanding into other areas, that there became a need for a formalization of the Imam's work in those countries, and therefore the need for formalized agreements. And really, diplomatic offices and diplomatic representations, as I have here in Canada, are outcomes of this relationship, bilateral relationship between the Imamate and a country. We have today 15 countries that we have formal Imamate relationships with, covered by 11 diplomatic representatives, which have spanned now probably 20 years or 20 plus years in how the Imamate has approached these sort of diplomatic relations in contemporary times. Canada is actually the youngest of the lot, which was an agreement signed by Prime Minister Harper and Maulana Azimam in 2014. And you might ask the question is, why does one need an agreement? It is really, if one thinks back in the Canadian context, the Jamaat is approaching 50 years of settlement in Canada. Almost immediately, very early on, the Imam had established IPS here as a means by which he could assist the Jamaat in building its capacity. AKF is 40 years old, so that's sort of 10 years into our settlement in Canada. And then since then, there has been an explosion of activities by AKDN agencies in Canada. We have the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, the Aga Khan Museum, we have the Aga Khan University, the University of Central Asia, the Aga Khan Academies, the Aga Khan Agency for Habitat, and of course the foundation as well. And so the nature of the agreement between Canada and the Imamate was to bring some kind of structured approach in our bilateral engagement in how we do business between the Imamate agencies and the government of Canada, and more recently, both at a federal level and at a provincial level. But this agreement also allowed for the establishment of a diplomatic office in Canada, and that this diplomatic office would have certain courtesies. So the government of Canada has very graciously extended to the imamate and its representatives, the ability to be part of the diplomatic corps. Have red plates on the cars, for example, and we have a diplomatic card. So all of the courtesies that are extended to ambassadors and embassies have been extended to the delegation of the Ismaili Imamate and its representation here in Canada as well. And there are perhaps three things that we would say that I do here in Canada. One is to coordinate the agency's activities in Canada with respect to things like government relations. We can't have all agencies talking to ministries at the same time. So there's a coordination of government relations. There is also the assistance of Canadian interests in countries where we operate. And that's a very important dimension because the relationship is bilateral and it is mutually reinforcing and mutually beneficial. So it's a two-way street. And so where Canada may have interests or issues or things of interest in countries where we have a presence and we have strength, I facilitate through the diplomatic office Canada's engagement with the imamate and its agencies and instrumentalities, wherever that might be. And I think the third thing is simply what one would consider to be an ambassadorial role. It is the representation of the imam to the prime minister or to ministers and vice versa. Typically what an ambassador would do is what the function is of the diplomatic office here.
So, Maulana Hazrat often describes his role as having both spiritual and temporal dimensions. What is the significance of this, and why is it so important for others to really understand this?
I think it's a challenge that we have also had in explaining this notion of what we would call deen and dunya, the temporal and the spiritual. In Islam, there is no separation between one and the other. It is your actions are your faith, are an expression of your faith. And that is why Hazrat Imam speaks so much about ethics, as opposed to theology or anything else. It is the ethics of your faith. It's how you behave, how you act, how you do things that are intrinsic to your faith. So you can't separate one from the other. We often get questions about how people see His Highness the Aga Khan. Is he an entrepreneur? Is he a philanthropist? Is he a racehorse owner? Is he, a celebrity of sorts? And we always try and tie it down to, he may be doing all of those things, but those are actually none of the things that are important. They are essentially a byproduct of his central role, which is the Imam of a Muslim community, a Shia Ismaili Muslim community, who has a responsibility and a role. And that responsibility and role is actioned through the instrumentalities that the imamate has created, which today we know as the AKDN. So the AKDN is a contemporary endeavor of the Ismaili imamate to realize the social conscience of Islam through institutional action. And that explains the role, the interplay between deen and dunya.
We are weeks away from an election south of the border in the United States, and whether it's COVID response or its leadership, the United States is perceived very differently on the world stage than it was 4 years ago. What does this mean for Canada as a leader on the global stage?
So I think that's an interesting question, Farah. And I would perhaps respond to it in a couple of ways. I think, first of all, one has to look at Canada's own response to COVID-19. And it is very different from the United States, both at the federal level and at the provincial level. In the United States, there is a federal government and state levels as well. Here, Canada has very much been dictated by the science. It has gone through all of the processes to comply with the science and to minimize the infectious spread by insisting that the population as a whole, who have been actually, I think, very good for the most part, in complying with those kinds of best practices. I think Canada also has a role to play in the international arena. Canada is a member of the G7. It is a member of the G20. It has the appetite, the desire, the intention to be able to, I think, play a role in the international space in which it is located in bringing about a global response to COVID. And I think Canada believes that this cannot be solved by a country-by-country response. It is a global pandemic. It affects everybody. And we have to have a global response in terms of vaccine production, in terms of medical equipment, everything. And I think, and even a response to Canada's view of the developing world. People who are more marginalized, disenfranchised, not likely to be able to get access to a whole variety of different things that they will require in order to combat COVID. Canada is playing a role and has a strong voice in the international community's response and support for vulnerable communities as well. So I think Canada does have a significant role to play. From the conversations I've had in government, they have indicated that that's certainly one of the things that they would like for Canada to do in the upcoming period of time, is to play a stronger role in the international response to COVID.
An interesting perspective there. When we look at this time we're living in, a time of misinformation, of fake news, as we enter the second wave of COVID in many parts of this country, what advice do you have for the Jamat?
Well, I think the first thing I would say to the Jamat is that Maulana Hazrat Imam has been quite explicit, quite clear to the Jamati leaders and to the Jamat directly, that we have to follow the best practice in medicine. We have to comply with the regulations, and there should be no ambiguity in the minds of the Jamat about the dangers and risks of not doing so. There are many different responses out there as to the validity of COVID. It's like the flu, it's not serious, a whole range of things in lots of countries, whether it's even segments in Canada, United States, South America, Western Europe, as to the seriousness of this. But we should be absolutely clear. The Imam has said it is dangerous. It can and has caused death to a significant number, and we must do everything we can to be, I would say, safe, not just safe, but cognizant of our responsibility towards ourselves and towards others. And I think even President Amir has spoken about this on several occasions. But my strong advice to the Jamaat is take care, be cognizant, and do everything in your power to comply with the medical advice.
I'm glad you reiterated that. Thank you. Now, if we consider the term ambassador in an informal sense, how do you see Canadian Jamati members playing roles as an ambassador, and what can we do to help you advance Maulana Hazrat Imam's vision here in Canada?
So I think it's an interesting question, Farah, and it's a question that I've faced many times, not only from members of the Jamaat, but there are others from on the outside who look into the community and see how we act, behave, what we believe in, how we express ourselves, which I think are very important. I think the first thing for the Jamaat to understand is that we have in each one of us the ability to act our faith through what we do, what we say, how we say it, and to whom we say it. And that is very important. This is not an institutional responsibility, therefore. It is not something that the president of the council or the diplomatic representative or an agency head needs to deal with. There are responses through those means. But as a member of the Jamaat, what you do, how you say it, what you actually communicate to a person is absolutely a reflection of your ethics and values. And I think this does not have to be complicated. It can be a gesture. It can be an act of help to somebody. A notion that causes someone to say thank you and look at you differently. And you have changed someone's perception through what you have done. So I think Being an ambassador in that sense is a responsibility for each and every one of us to ensure that we reflect in our attitudes, in our engagements, our values, our ethics, our understanding of how we interpret the faith of Islam. So I think that's the first thing to be mindful of. I think the second in being an ambassador is the help that I would need is for everybody in the Jamaat to understand why the Imam has built what he has built over these last 64 years. That there is a purpose, and he has continued a legacy from Sultan Muhammad Shah, may peace be upon him, and a legacy that is 1400 years long. There is nothing new as a contemporarization today of what the Imamate does in modern times. But there is nothing new in terms of the agenda over 1400 years. The focus on education, the focus on health, the focus on respect for other communities and pluralism, the idea of multiculturalism, if we were to use it that way, respect for diversity. Even the Quranic ayat that Maulana Hazrat Imam chose for the Diamond Jubilee emblem was a statement from the Quran that speaks to the idea of one humanity but diversity and therefore pluralism. And it's important for the Jamaat to understand why each agency has done what it has done. They're not whimsical at all. They are all thought through very carefully. They're all grounded in an ethic that we could speak to, whether it's ethic of sound mind, ethic of education, education of responsibility to the environment, for example, which is one of the core values that we might have. And so when you think about the AKDN, it is a contemporary endeavor of the Ismaili Imamate to realize the social conscience of Islam through institutional action. It is an instrumentality, it is a mechanism of the Imam's own engagement with the ethics of the faith and how he can actually fulfill his mandate. And I think it's absolutely critical that when you see Hazrat Imam open a building, a plant, a hospital wing, that they understand the reasons why, because then you're able to articulate it. I would say secondly, with respect to Canada, we have here extraordinary assets that the Imam has given to this country. We have the gardens in Edmonton, we have the park in Toronto, we have these two Ismaili centers, we have the Aga Khan Museum, we have the delegation building. This is $1 billion of investment in this country. And we would need to ask ourselves, why has the Imam committed so much capacity, so many resources to this country? And I think it's for a very simple reason. It is because Hazrat Imam believes that these are spaces and places that represent our values. These are ambassadorial buildings. These are representational buildings. These spaces speak to our values and ethics. And it is important for us as members of the Canadian Jamat to be able to look at these spaces and use them in a way that can enhance our engagement with Canada and with other parts of the world. The Global Center for Pluralism is another institution that the Imam positioned in Canada. Why? It's because Hazrat Imam believed that Canada is one of the few countries in the world that has actually, over its history, short 150 years, relative to the Imamate, which is 1400. In its 150 years, it has come to respect diversity. It has come to embrace pluralism. And the question would be, it's not perfect. How can we, the Ismaili Imamate and the government of Canada, use that experience to be able to promote, to educate, to help others understand these fundamental core ethical precepts which are essential for humanity to move forward peacefully.
One of the greatest moments of pride for our Jamaat, I think, was in 2014 when Maulana Hazrat Imam spoke to the Canadian Parliament. What was the significance of that for you, and what does it symbolize?
Well, I think first of all, what's important to recognize there is that it is the government of Canada, the Prime Minister, inviting a Muslim leader inviting a Muslim leader to address the entirety of Parliament, that in and of itself is a huge statement of how Canada views the Ismaili imamate and the Imam of the time. There are very few people outside of heads of states who have actually addressed the Canadian Parliament. And I think for Canada, it was being, the invitation for Hazrat Imam to speak at that time was at the same time as the agreement of cooperation was being negotiated and worked on between Canada and the Imamate. And it was for Canada to be able to project this person through this parliamentary address to say, here is a person that we have immense respect for, his values, his ethics, and what he can bring to Canada and what we can do together. And it was an opportunity for Hazrat Imam himself in that speech to express who he is. He started the entire parliamentary address by his historic rooting and origin. He starts by saying, I am a descendant of the Prophet, may peace be upon him, through Hazrat Ali. He goes into that totally unapologetic. He's saying, this is who I am. And who I am means this is what is important to me. This is what is important to my community. And this is how, together, Canada and ourselves, we will hopefully improve and make Canada even better and richer a country than it is today. And my sense that that was what was the intention behind it. I think I give the speech out, both the Portuguese parliamentary speech and the Canadian parliamentary speech, to every incoming ambassador that I meet with as a sort of frame of reference that if you want to know why this diplomatic office is here, please read these two speeches. And I think they are powerful and that we should utilize them much more. It was a statement from the Imam of the time to the Canadian government and to Canada. And I think we should use that in every opportunity that we can. And you're right, Farah, a moment of great pride, not only for the Canadian Jamat, but for the global Jamat.
And I think further to what you said about understanding the reasons why everything is happening, even for the ambassadors, the informal ambassadors in our Jamaat, that would be required reading to start. Let's talk about the future. When we look 50 years from now, what would you like to see when it comes to Canada's relationship with the Imamate and with the Ismailis?
So I would say that the first thing to remember is that Hazrat Imam has from the very beginning always seen Canada as a country of opportunity. It is a country of opportunity for I would say the kind of quality of life that the Imam hopes for his murids. If we were to look out into the future, I would say Canada is at the center of the knowledge society. And the creation of knowledge for the future is something that is very important for the Imamate. And it is very important for the Imamate to feed into that knowledge society. We live and operate in parts of the world where that knowledge creation and what it can do can be fed back, so that there is a mutually reinforcing ability to create knowledge together. Canada is a strong partner. We have, for example, relationships with almost every tertiary institution in Canada. And I think Hazrat Imam's probably received, 8 honorary degrees from Canadian institutions. It may be more, I'm not sure. But there is a strong sense of our ability to work together in a knowledge society context. I think the second is that there are many areas that we would work together in. Environment, climate change, how we might deal with the issues of vulnerable communities around the world are all areas that I think that the Imamate in Canada can and will and have an appetite and a desire to work together in over the coming decades. And I think there is, of course, pluralism, as I mentioned before, the ability for this global institution, as opposed to just Canadian, being at the center of the discourse on what should happen if pluralism is to survive and thrive and become a central way in which human societies actually function and live together. So as I look out, I see the desire of Hazrat Imam to strengthen the relationship with Canada through the whole spectrum of activities that the network is engaged in, and actually new areas of endeavor that we might discover as we go forward that both Canada and the Imamate can work together with. I think the second thing would be with respect to the Jamat. You know, in 50 years, we have today senators, we have members of parliament, we have mayors, we have captains of industry, we have people in the legal justice system, we have a lieutenant governor of a province. And it is how the community itself has become an integral part of the fabric of Canadian life that I think is important for us to remember and recognize. And think about that 50 years hence. I wouldn't want to be too presumptive, but I could see that where we are today, which is 50 years in, and you're asking about 50 years out from here, which would be 100 years into our settlement in Canada. So we would look at 2072, for example, or 2070. It would not surprise me if the Ismaili Muslim community of Canada was playing a very significant role in this country. And I think that is also a reflection of how the community's settlement and the community's progress and Hazrat Imam's aspirations for the Jamaat in Canada are aligned. And I think thirdly, if I was to just put this as a final thought, it is how our ability as a Jamaat in Canada over the next 50 years can help strengthen and develop our Jamaati institutions, AKDN institutions in other parts of the world, so that they have the same kind of opportunities that we might have here in Canada.
What an enlightening answer. And, I was smiling ear to ear when you were talking about what the trajectory of the Jamaat in Canada could look like, as I'm sure many people in our audience were. And with that, the future, it sure looks bright. I want to move on to the significance of the seat of the Imamate. I think many of us would like to understand that better. So before I start with my question to you, Dr. Ibu, I want to play this clip of Maulana Hazrat Imam speaking to the Portuguese Parliament on July 10th, 2018.
Through the centuries, the seat of the Ismaili Imamate has been formally designated in one or more locations by the Imam of the time, depending on the requirements of the day. It has known many homes over the years throughout the Arabian Peninsula, in the Middle East, in South Asia, and in North Africa. It moved to Cairo in the 10th century when my ancestors founded that city. The decision to establish a new seat here in Portugal, at the gracious invitation of your government, is one that has been taken after much reflection and consultation. It represents a true milestone moment in the long history of the Imamate.
Dr. Ibu, how did the move to Portugal come about?
Well, it was an extraordinary clip of a memorable occasion of Hazrat Imam's address to the Parliament in Portugal. Hazrat Imam has always considered Portugal to be a country of opportunity. And when the Jamaat was settled back in the 70s in Lorenzo Marques, and when it got its independence and became Mozambique, the Jamaat moved to Portugal, obviously being a Portuguese-speaking country, Mozambique being a Portuguese-speaking country. And as with other countries around the world that Hazrat Imam is considered as countries of opportunity, the Imam started to build institutional capacity there. It was an early decision in his mind for us to have an Ismaili Center in Lisbon, which everybody knows was opened in 1997. But the thinking for that Ismaili Center was actually in the late 70s and the early 80s. And so as the relationships began to gel in Portugal, our relationships with the government, programs that the Imamate was doing in Portugal in collaboration with the government, that series of interventions and agreements between the Imamate in Portugal led the Portuguese government to invite Hazrat Imam to formalize his headquarters in Portugal. And that's why Hazrat Imam makes reference to, at the invitation of the Portuguese government in the speech. It was really their sense that the Imamate headquarters in Portugal would provide the basis for the Imamate to be able to operate in a different way. So, for the first 60 years of the Imamate, Hazrat Imam's headquarters has been in Eglamont, as we all know. But it was not a sort of legal entity at all. It was a base from which the Imam operated. The invitation of the Portuguese government to establish the Imamate's headquarters, and therefore by extension a seat in a more formalized definitional sense, provides now a formal legal entity in Portugal, which enables the Imamate to be able to, I think, do a range of things that it may not otherwise have been able to do before. And it is through an act of parliament. So I have to congratulate and remember our colleagues in Portugal, the Jamati leadership, the institutional leadership who worked with the Portuguese government, and which resulted in a unanimous decision in Parliament for Portugal to allow the Imam of the time to establish the seat, and which was signed into force by the President of Portugal in 2015. And as Hazrat Imam says, it is a milestone event in the history of the Imamate, which is 1400 years. And I think will provide capabilities and capacities, new opportunities for the Imamate to operate over the next 100 years or 200 years in a very different way than it was able to in the past 100 odd years. So an incredibly epical occasion in the history of the Jamat.
Dr. Ibu, for this next part, I hope you don't mind, I want to get a little personal. So following in your family's footsteps, you've served the Imam and the Jamat for decades. In its early days, you were the president of the Council for the USA. You were LIF chair, and now, of course, AKDN rep. So can you tell us a little bit about how you first got involved in work of the Imam?
Well, that's also an interesting question, Farah. And I would say to you, quite honestly, it was not intentional or even by design. Certainly not by accident, but I was called one day, it was July the 10th, 1987, by the president of the council and said, "Are you going to be in Jamat Khana tomorrow, the 11th? And I said, "Yes, I'm going to be in Jamat Khana." And he said, "Good." And there I was in Jamat Khana, and I heard my name announced as an Imamate appointee, which was the chairman for ITREB Eastern USA. And of course, at the time, this was a new institution. ITREB had only just been included in the new constitution 6 months earlier. And so I had absolutely no idea, first, that I would ever be appointed, and secondly, what this institution was about. So I would say that sometimes these things happen in your life when you least expect it. I had a 3-month-old daughter at the time. And I did actually, honestly, Farah, think that I would be engaged in Jamati service on a continuous basis, which is now 34 years. At that time, I thought, I'll do something for 3 years, end of the term, and carry on with my professional life. But it actually just continued, one term after another. And I would say that later on, I came to sort of realize that, this has been an extraordinary blessing. It became almost like a path that was opening up constantly for me to be going down. And I have to say, it has been an enormous blessing, an enormous grace, and a privilege to have been able to serve the Jamaat in these last 34 years in the way that I have. You have this unique vantage point through your decades of service.
What do you see as the trajectory for Imamate institutions in the future, and how far have they come from the past?
If I was to look at the Imamate institution, they have grown and matured over the last 5 decades or 6 decades. There has been a central element to everything that the Imam has sought to do in building these institutions and this institutional capacity. First of all, quality. The ability for, whether it's in Jamat institutions, providing a service to members of the Jamat, their brothers and sisters, or whether it's an AKDN institution running a school or a health center or a business. The hallmark for Hazrat Imam has been quality. We must always ensure that we are best practice in what we do and how we respond to things. I think the second thing that certainly within the Jamati organizations is that Hazrat Imam has put a very strong emphasis on the induction of women into Jamati institutional leadership. And if I was to look back in 1987 at the council at that time, or the Tariqa boards at that time, and I was to count around the table how many women there might have been, it was less than even a single handful back then. But today, if you look around the table at institutional leadership that he appoints, the number of women that are in senior leadership positions is extraordinary. And I think that is something that Hazrat Imam will continue to push forward. I think the third thing is that the capacity for leaders to be able to think. The Imam knows that there are problems, and that's why institutions are there. It's to help solve problems. But solving problems means not just expressing them to the Imam and saying, here's a problem. It is, what are your solutions? What are the things that you can think through, that you can propose, that have enough to them that will solve a particular problem for not just a particular country, but it could be a global issue. And how can we do about that? And so the ability for merit to be introduced into institutional leadership has been the third big change that I've seen over the years. Today, Hazrat Imam focuses on meritocracy. Does the person that is being proposed for leadership position across the entire spectrum have the competence, the skills to be able to do the job, help the Jamaat in a particular way? So merit and meritocracy is the third hallmark, I think, of what I've seen as a change in the last 30 odd years. And I think the fourth is Hazrat Imam's predisposition for humility. It is that leadership should always be humble. It should always be responsive. It should always have an ear to people's needs at any time, at all times, and to be able to respond to them in a meaningful way. That is, after all, a central ethic of how we are and how we operate as a community. And it is something I think the Imam has attached enormous value to, enormous respect for, and ultimately recognition as well. So I see today, in 1987 there were only, I think, 8 national councils. Today there are 20. And so we are expanding geographically, new institutions being created, and the ability for this institutional leadership, Jamati Seva, to be able to be efficient, effective, responsive, and ethical are really things that I have seen shifted over the last 35 odd years. And inshallah, I think that will continue to be the focus and the drive of how Hazrat Imam sees leadership evolution and development moving forward.
As we look at the future, I'm going to end with this question, because many young Ismailis across Canada and really around the world could be watching us right now. And if they're not, their parents or their grandparents are. So I want you to, for a moment, if you would, look back at your younger self, maybe the age of 25. What advice would you give that young man with all the experience and wisdom that you have accumulated over many decades of service?
What I would say, if I was to reflect to when I was back in my 20s, and I would say, what is the advice I've given my 2 daughters who are, in their early 30s now, 3-4 years ago. The advice I gave them is the same advice I would share with young members of the Jamat today. Your education, inshallah, if you've had the blessing to have one, and if you haven't, we will do everything we can to get you one, is a blessing and it is an asset. And I would say to my younger brothers and sisters here in Canada, it's an asset that you should recognize is not an asset just for you, it's an asset for your family, and it's an asset for the Jamaat. We are at risk of murids who have had extraordinary educational opportunities of becoming self-serving, self-centered, and selfish. In other words, they think about it only for their own benefit. Whereas we should be not looking at it from that point of view, but we should be looking at it from the point of view of being selfless, and we should be looking at it from the point of view of being self-fulfilling. Okay? There is a capacity that you have been blessed with. And so when I talked to my daughters, it was always around the principle that you have the privilege of an education. You have the opportunities of life that others may not have, but don't ever forget that that capacity has with it a responsibility. And your responsibility is to use that education for the benefit of others and not just necessarily for yourself. And yes, of course, it is important for you to have a good quality of life. It is important for you to have a nice home, a nice car. But when you get to your third Mercedes and your fourth home, you've crossed a line where you've become so enamored with your own capacities, your own self, that you have forgotten the benefit to others. So I would say to them, number one, think about that. Number two, use the platforms that we have in the Jamaat. We have TKN, we have the Jamati Seva. These are extraordinary opportunities, not just to give of yourself, but as Hazrat said in the parliamentary speech in Canada, a pathway to self-enlightenment. And it is a pathway to self-enlightenment. So I would say, think about those things, how you would use your knowledge for the benefit of others, and the means through which you can actually do it. Those would be my sort of quick ideas of important things that I think younger members of the Jamaat should remember.
You reminded me, speaking as a father, of something my father told me, that we were born with the winning lottery ticket, but with that lottery ticket comes an enormous responsibility. So thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your words of wisdom, your hope for the future, and allowing me to ask some personal questions. It's been a true pleasure speaking with you. Thank you, Dr. Ibu.
Thank you, Farah. Much appreciated.
Dr. Ibu, thank you for giving us your time today, for your inspirational words and insights, as always. I would like to share another set of fascinating conversations that continue our exploration of Maulana Hazrat Imam's vision and his work here in Canada. On Sunday, October 18th, mark your calendars, we're going to travel to the Aga Khan Garden in Alberta. We're going to explore this Diamond Jubilee project with the original architect, Thomas Woltz, as well as take part in a conversation with the mayor of Edmonton himself, Don Iveson, and the president of the University of Alberta, Bill Flanagan. And this will be on the importance of architecture and public green spaces in fostering pluralism. So we hope you will join us. As we end our show, we have some wonderful musical expressions to rejuvenate and reconnect us, as we always do. So thank you again for joining us. It has been such a pleasure to once again be your host and spend time with you. So please stay on to enjoy our musical pieces, and see you next Friday.
लब पे आती है दुआ बन के तमन्ना मेरी, लब पे आती है दुआ बन के तमन्ना मेरी, जिंदगी शम्मा की सूरत हो खुदाया मेरी। की सूरत हो खुदाया मेरी, लब पे आती है दुआ बन के तमन्ना मेरी। हो मेरे दम से यूं ही मेरे वतन की जीनत, हो मेरे दम से यूं ही मेरे वतन की जीनत, जिस तरह फूल से होती है चमन की जीनत, जिस तरह फूल से होती है चमन की जीनत, जिंदगी हो मेरी परवाने की सूरत या रब, जिंदगी हो मेरी परवाने की सूरत या रब, इल्म की शम्मा से हो मुझको मोहब्बत या रब, इल्म की शम्मा से हो मुझको मोहब्बत या रब। हो मेरा काम गरीबों की हिमायत करना, हो मेरा काम गरीबों की हिमायत करना, दर्दमंदों से ज़ईफ़ों से मोहब्बत करना, दर्दमंदों से ज़ईफ़ों से